Lucy Walsh worked as a cashier at a Walmart on the outskirts of Portland, Maine. At 34, Lucy had long stopped believing in romantic fairy tales. She led a simple life, focusing on work and keeping up with her routine. Raised in a working-class family, Lucy learned to prioritize stability and avoid taking risks in her personal life. She'd gone through a few short relationships, but they all ended without much impact. Her co-workers described her as reserved, friendly, and reliable, a person who rarely spoke about her personal matters. One winter evening, Lucy met Mike Turner, a customer who came by her register regularly after work. Mike was an electrician, also middle-aged, divorced, and known for his practical demeanor and friendly smile. His routine stops at Walmart were initially uneventful, yet over time, he struck up conversations with Lucy. They discussed common topics, like long work hours and dealing with the cold Maine winters. He noticed she was quiet, and he took that as an opportunity to do most of the talking. Lucy felt comfortable around him and appreciated his relaxed, easygoing approach. Over the following weeks, their interactions became more frequent. Mike often lingered by her checkout lane after making small purchases. He appeared straightforward, sometimes mentioning his past marriage and hinting at the challenges he had faced. For Lucy, he seemed like an ordinary, honest man who had gone through a lot, but maintained a positive outlook. Eventually, he asked her out to dinner at a local diner, one of the modest establishments where both felt at ease. Their dates were unpretentious, usually involving simple meals at nearby diners, or a walk around the quieter parts of the city. Mike appeared attentive, often complimenting Lucy on her practicality and steady job. He spoke about his life as an electrician, the clients he worked for, and his goals of starting a small business someday. Lucy, though reserved, found herself sharing parts of her life she rarely disclosed to others. Mike's apparent stability and down-to-earth nature resonated with her. She felt a sense of companionship she hadn't experienced before. 6 months into their relationship, Mike proposed marriage. The proposal wasn't elaborate or planned with extravagance. One evening, over dinner, he simply said he couldn't imagine his life without her. He presented her with a modest ring and expressed his hopes of building a life together. Lucy was surprised by the suddenness, but felt a growing sense of trust in him. While she knew their relationship was new, she thought that this could be her opportunity to finally settle down with someone dependable. Lucy accepted his proposal with a sense of practicality, believing it was a step toward a stable future. The two agreed on a modest wedding, deciding to keep the event simple and to the point. Lucy felt a mix of contentment and cautious optimism, imagining a life that, while not idealized, was grounded in mutual understanding and straightforward goals. 2 weeks before her wedding, Lucy Walsh sat in the passenger seat of Mike Turner's truck, a worn and well-used Ford pickup that had served him through countless miles of work commutes and odd jobs. The couple was out running errands, finalizing last-minute details for their upcoming wedding. That day, they had a list of places to go, and Lucy, trying to keep them organized, reached over to check the glove compartment for a map she thought she'd left there on a previous trip. Instead of the map, however, her fingers brushed across something unexpected, a credit card that wasn't Mike's. She pulled it out and read the name printed on it. Karen Williams. Immediately, Lucy's heart skipped a beat. She paused, staring at the card in her hand, a growing sense of unease creeping over her. When she asked Mike about it, he seemed momentarily startled, but then casually explained that he had found it outside a client's house. According to Mike, he'd been working on a job fixing some faulty wiring in a residential neighborhood when he noticed the card lying on the ground near his truck. He had picked it up, intending to return it, but had apparently forgotten all about it amidst the busyness of work and wedding preparations. He assured her it was an innocent mistake, one he would quickly rectify. Although she nodded along with his words, the conversation left her with a strange, uncomfortable feeling. Lucy was a practical person, not one to dwell on minor details or read too deeply into things. However, she was not completely naive, and her intuition had served her well in the past. There was a nagging sense that this wasn't just a simple oversight. The name Karen Williams held no meaning to her, and she had no previous reason to suspect Mike of dishonesty. But the discovery lingered in her mind. It was a small but significant moment that planted seeds of doubt in a relationship she had believed to be solid. Over the next few days, Lucy found herself replaying the incident in her mind. She questioned why a man who was typically so organized would simply forget about a stranger's credit card. The explanation, though plausible, felt too convenient. In her gut, she sensed that something was not adding up, but she kept these thoughts to herself, rationalizing them as pre-wedding nerves. After all, she had invested emotionally in this relationship and was only days away from marrying Mike. She reminded herself that trust was essential, and doubting him now seemed unreasonable. Still, her instincts wouldn't let the matter rest. Each time she thought back to the credit card, her mind conjured up more questions. Who was Karen Williams? Why hadn't Mike mentioned her before? If he had nothing to hide, why hadn't he brought it up on his own? Lucy realized she knew relatively little about Mike's life before they met. He had always been open about his divorce, but beyond a few vague mentions, he rarely spoke about his past. The more she thought about it, the more it felt like she had been given only the parts of his life he wanted her to see. One evening, while Mike was out on a work call, Lucy found herself pacing around their shared home, struggling to quiet her suspicions. She felt torn. On the one hand, she wanted to trust him and believe that his explanation about the credit card had been genuine. But the uncertainty gnawed at her. She knew that without any further information, her doubts would persist, so she decided to take matters into her own hands. Knowing Mike was meticulous about his tools and equipment, she headed into the garage, thinking that, if he had anything to hide, he would likely store it among his personal belongings. In the corner of the garage, she spotted Mike's old toolbox. It was a weathered metal box, filled with the various tools he used on jobs around town. Lucy had seen him reach into this box numerous times without thinking much of it. But now, she approached it with a feeling of dread, half hoping she wouldn't find anything unusual. She lifted the lid and began to sift through the contents, moving screwdrivers, pliers, and other tools aside. After a few minutes of searching, her hand brushed across a stack of folded papers hidden beneath a set of screwdrivers. She pulled them out, realizing they were receipts. Each one bore the name of a nearby Holiday Inn motel and listed payments that had been made over the past several months. Lucy felt her pulse quicken as she leafed through the receipts. The dates ranged across various weekends and weekdays, some coinciding with times she recalled Mike mentioning he was working late on a job. She noted that the payments were consistent, suggesting regular visits. What initially appeared to be an innocent discovery now felt like a confirmation of her worst fears. Alongside the receipts was a small envelope containing several photographs. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled the photos out and looked at them. Each one showed Mike with a woman she didn't recognize, a woman who, based on the images, seemed to be close to him. They appeared relaxed together, smiling in ways Lucy had never seen Mike smile with her. In one of the photos, they stood side by side in a motel room, the bed unmade behind them. They looked comfortable, almost domestic, as if they had been spending time there for a while. Lucy's heart sank as she flipped over one of the photographs and found a handwritten message on the back. "Happy anniversary, Karen. Love, Mike. Christmas, 2023. Reading those words, Lucy felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her. Not only was the woman in the photographs clearly someone significant to Mike, but the message on the back of the photograph left no room for doubt. He had celebrated an anniversary with this woman, Karen Williams, the same name on the credit card she had found earlier. It was now undeniable that Mike had been living a double life. The evidence in her hands was irrefutable, and Lucy could no longer dismiss her fears as mere paranoia. Lucy continued to examine the contents of the envelope, looking through each photograph and comparing the dates with the entries on the receipts. Every piece of evidence pointed to a relationship that had been ongoing for several months, overlapping entirely with their engagement. As she reviewed the bank statements on her phone, Lucy discovered a series of payments to the Holiday Inn, each aligning with the receipts she had found. The pattern was undeniable, reinforcing the reality that Mike had been deceitful from the beginning. That night, Lucy couldn't sleep. The revelation weighed heavily on her, and she felt trapped by the knowledge she now held. She wondered if Karen, the woman in the photographs, knew about her, or if she too had been deceived. It was possible that Karen had no idea Mike was engaged to another woman, just as Lucy had no inkling about his life with Karen. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. Lucy wanted answers, but she also wanted justice for the months she had spent believing in a relationship that was a lie. On May 5th, the day dawned clear and bright in Portland, Maine. The spring sunshine cast a warm glow over the small, modest church where Lucy Walsh and Mike Turner were set to be married. The ceremony was planned to be simple, attended by about 30 guests, mostly a mix of Lucy's co-workers from the Walmart store where she worked as a cashier, a few neighbors from their quiet residential street, and some of Mike's colleagues from his electrical work. The ceremony began as expected, with the minister leading the congregation through the initial vows. Lucy stood beside Mike, her heart racing as she mentally prepared for what she was about to do. The revelations from days prior, about Mike's secret relationship with Karen Williams and the stack of receipts and photos she had found, had haunted her every waking moment. But today, she had resolved to confront Mike in the most public way possible, hoping to expose his lies and, perhaps, finally find some closure. As the minister approached the question of objections, Lucy knew it was her moment. She took a breath, steadying herself. When he asked, "If anyone has any objections, speak now or forever hold your peace," Lucy raised her hand, startling everyone in attendance. She stepped forward, holding a small envelope containing the photographs and receipts she had uncovered in Mike's toolbox just days earlier. Turning to face the guests, and finally Mike, she said, "I can't go through with this wedding. There's something everyone needs to know about Mike." The silence in the church was palpable as her voice echoed through the space, a note of controlled anger underlying her calm tone. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between Lucy and Mike, who had visibly tensed. Lucy held up the photographs, letting the guests see the images of Mike with another woman, with inscriptions on the back reading, "Happy Anniversary, Karen. Love, Mike." Her hand shook slightly, but her gaze remained steady as she recounted the details. She explained how she had discovered the credit card in Mike's truck, found the motel receipts, and realized he had been leading a double life with a woman named Karen Williams. The reaction in the room was immediate. There were audible gasps, and a few of Mike's colleagues exchanged bewildered looks. Mike tried to intervene, stepping forward to grab Lucy's arm, but she pulled away, refusing to let him silence her. She continued, revealing that Karen had believed Mike was working on long-term projects in other states. Karen had never filed for divorce, fearing she would lose her medical coverage, a critical resource for her as she managed a chronic illness, diabetes. The room erupted into murmurs and whispers. Guests, who had come expecting a quiet celebration, now found themselves witnesses to a shocking exposé. Lucy noticed the expressions of shock and discomfort on her co-workers' faces, people who had known her for years but had never seen her in such a vulnerable, resolute state. This was not the Lucy they were accustomed to seeing, the reserved, kind-hearted woman who rarely spoke about her personal life. Mike, stunned and visibly angry, tried to address the gathering. His calm demeanor had faded, replaced by a look of frustration as he struggled to regain control of the situation. He began denying Lucy's claims, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, an overreaction on her part. However, the photos in Lucy's hands were undeniable evidence, and no amount of explanation could erase the inscriptions in his own handwriting. Karen's story, as Lucy recounted it, added another layer of betrayal. Karen had trusted Mike, believing his claims that his extended absences were due to work. To avoid jeopardizing her medical insurance, Karen had not pursued a divorce, hoping to hold on to the support she needed to manage her condition. Now, her trust had been shattered as well, and the guests, though only learning of Karen through Lucy's revelations, seemed to feel the weight of this additional betrayal. The minister stood silently, caught between his role in the ceremony and the unfolding scandal, unsure of how to proceed. The guests' reactions varied. Some looked away, others whispered among themselves, and a few appeared visibly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Lucy, meanwhile, felt a sense of relief wash over her. While the pain of betrayal lingered, the act of exposing Mike had given her a sense of control she hadn't felt since discovering his lies. With her confrontation complete, Lucy quietly left the church, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. She did not look back at Mike or the guests, Nor did she wait to see the fallout from her actions. The evening of May 5th, the day that was supposed to be Lucy Walsh's wedding day, turned into a night of tragedy. After the shocking events at the church, where Lucy had exposed Mike Turner's deception in front of their family and friends, she returned to the house she had shared with him. The revelation had left her emotionally drained, but she was resolute in her decision to move forward without him. The confrontation had been her attempt to reclaim her dignity and make a definitive statement against the lies she had uncovered. However, Lucy did not anticipate the tragic events that would unfold that night. As dusk fell over the quiet neighborhood, Lucy's neighbors noticed an unusual activity at her residence. Mike's familiar truck, a Ford F-150, pulled into the driveway. Although Lucy's neighbors were accustomed to seeing his truck there, the tense circumstances surrounding the failed wedding and the public exposure of Mike's infidelity made his arrival concerning. Several neighbors later recalled feeling uneasy, noting that the confrontation earlier in the day had cast a shadow over what was usually a peaceful community. Inside the house, Lucy was startled by the sudden arrival of Mike, who entered without warning. She had been gathering her thoughts, contemplating her next steps, and considering how she might rebuild her life in the wake of the shattered relationship. But before she had time to react, she was confronted by an enraged Mike, who had come to demand an explanation, and perhaps even a retraction of the accusations she had made earlier in the church. Fueled by anger and a sense of betrayal, he immediately confronted her, his demeanor far removed from the calm and reassuring partner he had once pretended to be. The argument quickly escalated. Witnesses reported hearing raised voices coming from Lucy's home, their words indistinct, but the tone unmistakably hostile. The voices were loud enough that several neighbors were alerted, some pausing their evening routines to listen. Through open windows, they could hear Lucy and Mike arguing, the intensity of their voices a disturbing contrast to the usual calm of the residential street. At one point, Lucy's voice was heard clearly, her tone defiant, yet fearful. Neighbors later described the tension in her voice as a mixture of anger and fear. Then, the shouting abruptly gave way to a chilling silence, punctuated only by a single piercing scream. The sudden quiet that followed was unsettling, and those who had been listening closely felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Moments later, Mike's truck was seen leaving the driveway, its headlights cutting through the evening darkness as he sped away from the scene. His departure was hasty and erratic, leaving no doubt in the minds of those who saw him that something terrible had occurred. Concerned, a neighbor decided to check on Lucy, sensing that the silence following the argument was unnatural. When no response came from inside, they called the police, reporting the argument, the scream, and Mike's abrupt departure. The local authorities arrived swiftly, but the scene they encountered inside the house was far worse than anyone had anticipated. Lucy's body was discovered in the kitchen, lying in a pool of blood near the counter. The fatal wound was inflicted by a kitchen knife, and it was clear that she had struggled in her final moments. Nearby, on the kitchen counter, investigators found a grim reminder of the events that had led to this tragedy. The photographs and motel receipts that had exposed Mike's infidelity. The blood-spattered evidence lay as a stark testament to the betrayal that had cost Lucy her life. Forensic teams quickly secured the scene, gathering evidence that might help build a case against Mike. They carefully examined the blood-stained photographs and receipts, understanding that these items had played a critical role in the confrontation that ultimately led to her death. The officers noted the signs of a struggle in the kitchen, with items knocked over and traces of blood on various surfaces, indicating that Lucy had tried to defend herself against her attacker. It was a desperate struggle, but in the end, she had been unable to escape the fatal encounter. The police wasted no time in launching a manhunt for Mike Turner. His history of deceit and manipulation had been laid bare, and now he was wanted for a far more serious crime. With witnesses placing him at the scene and forensic evidence tying him to Lucy's murder, he was immediately identified as the prime suspect. The detectives coordinating the search knew that capturing him would be crucial, not only for delivering justice for Lucy, but also for preventing any further harm he might cause. In the following hours, authorities released an alert to surrounding areas, warning the public of a potentially dangerous man on the run. They distributed his photograph, description, and details about his vehicle, urging anyone who saw him to contact the police immediately. The community, still reeling from the news of Lucy's death, united in their calls for justice, sharing information and spreading awareness in hopes of assisting the authorities. As detectives reviewed the evidence and eyewitness accounts, they began to piece together the events that had led to Lucy's tragic end. The confrontation at the wedding had pushed Mike to a breaking point, triggering a violent response rooted in his fear of exposure and loss of control. Unable to face the reality of his actions and the public humiliation of his lies being revealed, he had turned to violence, attempting to silence the one person who had dared to stand against him. The investigation into Lucy Walsh's death progressed swiftly, with Portland police detectives focusing all available resources on locating and apprehending Mike Turner, who had fled the scene shortly after her murder. Within hours, they identified him as the prime suspect, based on witness reports of his truck leaving Lucy's house and the evidence found at the crime scene. Determined to bring him to justice, the detectives launched a citywide search, distributing his description and vehicle details to neighboring counties and coordinating with law enforcement in nearby states. As they delved into Mike's background, a more disturbing picture of his past emerged. A records search quickly revealed that this was not the first time he had been involved in violent incidents. In 2015, Mike had been arrested in New Hampshire on charges of domestic assault. The incident involved his then-wife, who had reported him for physical abuse following an argument that had escalated to violence. However, due to the couple's later reconciliation, the charges had been dropped, and the case was closed. This record provided investigators with a clear indication of Mike's capacity for violence and his history of volatile behavior in relationships. Beyond his history of assault, detectives began uncovering details about Mike's lifestyle and financial activities that pointed to a pattern of deceit and manipulation. Interviews with acquaintances and former co-workers painted the image of a man who was charming on the surface but consistently untrustworthy and elusive about his personal life. It soon became clear that Mike's deceit extended far beyond his relationships with Lucy and Karen Williams. A third woman, a waitress at a local diner, was also entangled in his complex web of lies. The waitress, identified as Emily Green, had been involved with Mike for nearly a year. She had believed, as both Lucy and Karen had, that he was committed to building a future with her. Mike had told her he was in the process of starting a small electrical business, a venture he claimed would bring them financial stability and prosperity. In reality, the business was little more than a fabrication designed to extract money from Emily. Like Karen and Lucy, Emily had provided him with financial support, contributing significant amounts to what she thought was a legitimate startup. Detectives interviewed Emily as part of their investigation, and her account matched the stories shared by both Lucy's and Karen's friends and family. She described how Mike had initially presented himself as hardworking and ambitious, frequently discussing his dreams of running his own business. His story, however, was peppered with requests for loans and financial assistance. Emily recalled how he would often ask her for small amounts, claiming it was to cover business expenses like permits, equipment, or vehicle maintenance. Over time, the sums had added up, resulting in thousands of dollars that he had taken from her with promises of future returns. As detectives reviewed financial records and transactions associated with Mike, they discovered a troubling pattern. Bank statements revealed payments from all three women, each of whom believed they were helping him establish a business. However, none of the funds had gone toward anything resembling a legitimate enterprise. Instead, the money had been spent on personal expenses, including hotel stays, dining, and other luxuries that had nothing to do with business operations. Investigators found no records of any registered business under his name, nor any permits or licenses indicating an attempt to establish a company. Mike's financial exploitation of these women demonstrated a clear pattern of manipulation. Each relationship followed a similar trajectory, with Mike establishing trust through charm and promises of a shared future, before gradually introducing requests for financial assistance. He had been methodical in his approach, carefully selecting women who, like Emily and Karen, had stable incomes and were emotionally vulnerable to his promises. In each case, he had woven an elaborate story of ambition and dedication, masking his true intentions until he had secured enough money to support his personal lifestyle. As detectives pieced together the connections between his relationships, they also examined the psychological tactics Mike had employed. His strategy of compartmentalizing his relationships, maintaining separate lives with each woman, allowed him to avoid suspicion for an extended period. He portrayed himself as a dedicated partner to each, carefully crafting narratives that would discourage questions about his long absences and unexplained expenses. In Karen's case, he had convinced her that his work required frequent travel, explaining his absences by claiming he was working on extended contracts out of state. The investigation also revealed that Mike had borrowed large sums from each woman under the pretense of needing startup capital for his electrical business. With Lucy, he had discussed plans for an electrical contracting business, even showing her fake business cards and a fabricated business plan that detailed services he claimed to offer. The plan was persuasive enough to convince her to contribute financially, believing she was helping build their future together. But just like with Karen and Emily, every dollar Lucy gave him was funneled into Mike's personal expenses rather than a business venture. Interviews with his former coworkers provided further insight into his character. Those who had worked with him described a man who often spoke grandly of his ambitions, but rarely followed through on his commitments. He frequently changed jobs, moving between short-term contracts and freelance work. Colleagues noted his tendency to embellish his achievements, often claiming he was on the verge of launching a successful business, yet never demonstrating the dedication or stability necessary to do so. His charisma had initially attracted people, but over time, many realized he was unreliable and prone to exaggeration. The cumulative evidence of fraud, deceit, and violence painted a damning picture of Mike's character. The detectives now faced the task of tracking him down. Given his history of evasion and manipulation, they believed he would attempt to flee and potentially seek help from former contacts. Detectives coordinated with state law enforcement agencies, issuing a warrant for his arrest and alerting the public to be on the lookout for Mike and his vehicle. 2 days after the murder of Lucy Walsh, Mike Turner was apprehended at a motel near the Canadian border. Law enforcement officials, who had been tracking his movements and monitoring the area, received a tip about a man matching his description checking into the motel under an alias. With his distinctive Ford F-150 truck found abandoned earlier, it was clear Mike intended to evade capture by fleeing the country. The motel was one of the last stops before crossing into Canada, suggesting he was making a final attempt to escape justice. A team of officers conducted the arrest with minimal incident. Mike was subdued and taken into custody without a struggle, his demeanor quiet and resigned. Once transported to a secure facility, he was held under close watch, and investigators prepared to question him about the events leading to Lucy's death. The confession they would receive was both a confirmation of his guilt and a disturbing insight into his motivations. During the interrogation, Mike admitted to the murder, though he portrayed it as an act driven by temporary insanity. He described the moments leading up to Lucy's death, claiming that her public revelation of his deceit at the wedding had triggered a loss of control. According to his account, the humiliation of being exposed before friends, family, and the community had pushed him into a state of momentary madness. He confessed to going to her house that evening, demanding explanations and retractions. When she refused, he claimed, he was overtaken by anger and acted impulsively. The detectives listened to his confession, but they were unconvinced by his claims of a temporary lapse in judgment. The evidence painted a far more deliberate picture of a man who, confronted by the collapse of his carefully constructed lies, resorted to violence to silence the person who had threatened to unravel his life. For the prosecution, Mike's admission of guilt would form a key component of their case, but his attempt to justify his actions as a product of public shame did little to sway the authorities. The trial, held in the main district court, attracted significant public attention. Lucy's murder had already become a focal point in the local community, and the revelations of Mike's long history of deceit and financial exploitation stirred outrage. As the trial began, evidence of his manipulative behavior and fraudulent relationships with multiple women was presented in detail. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had systematically taken advantage of others, crafting intricate lies to gain their trust and financial support, only to discard them when they no longer served his needs. The court also reviewed his criminal history, including the domestic assault charge from 2015 in New Hampshire. Though that case had been dismissed following reconciliation with his then-wife, it provided further evidence of his violent tendencies when faced with conflict. As each piece of evidence was laid out, the image of Mike Turner as a charming yet deeply manipulative individual became clear to all present. His defense team attempted to argue that the murder was unpremeditated, emphasizing his claim of temporary insanity, brought on by the public embarrassment he experienced at the church. However, the jury was unconvinced, viewing his actions as a calculated response to losing control over his web of lies. In the final days of the trial, more victims of Mike's scams came forward, individuals from New Hampshire and Massachusetts who recounted similar experiences of financial deceit. These testimonies illustrated that Mike's manipulation extended beyond his relationships with Lucy, Karen, and Emily. He had spent years refining his approach, targeting people for personal gain without regard for the harm he caused. For the first time, his pattern of dishonesty had led to deadly consequences, and the court acknowledged the severity of his crimes. After deliberation, the jury found Mike Turner guilty of first-degree murder, fraud, and several related charges. The judge, considering the calculated nature of his actions and the lasting impact on his victims, sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The severity of the sentence reflected the court's assessment of Mike as a persistent threat, both to individuals who might trust him in the future and to society as a whole. Lucy Walsh's family, though relieved by the verdict, found little solace in the outcome. The trial and sentencing had been a painful reminder of the loss they had suffered, and while justice had been served, it could not bring Lucy back. Her death became a symbol of the dangers posed by manipulative individuals who operate under the guise of trustworthiness, exploiting others for personal gain.